Hi everybody. So this video is just going to kind of be an overview of the lab. I'll explain what we would have done in class and how we're going to handle it here. There'll be another video about just dealing with the data and the graphs, and then a third video just looking specifically at the questions. I thought it was a better idea to do 3 separate videos than one big video. So this would have been our acute exercise lab, and basically we would have done 2 things in this lab. One, we would have done some VO2 max testing. Okay, so we did that before. I'm trying to think who our subject was, but just a graded exercise test where we start off at a low intensity and we continue to increase that intensity on the treadmill until the subject says they're done. So we would have done a couple VO2 max testing. And then the other thing that we are doing as part of this lab is a submaximal exercise test. And with that submaximal exercise test, we would use that data to predict a subject's VO2 max. So if we wanted to predict a subject's VO2 max, we don't necessarily have to do a max test on them. We can predict VO2 max and estimate VO2 max if we do a submaximal exercise test. So that's kind of the basics of what we're going to do. So let's kind of go through the procedures, okay, and how we would handle that. So like I said, we're going to do a graded exercise test, and it would have been a max test. So what I've done is I went back to, I don't know how many years ago. Was this just last fall, I think? Went back to fall, and I grabbed some data that I had from this lab from a subject that went through this. So, and you'll have this PDF document. It'll be posted online, so you'll be able to see this data. And I'll bring up this document again when in the data and graph video as well. Okay, so we do have data to work with for this lab. So that's what we'll be working with there. I can't. Okay. All right. So what this subject did, right? This was the protocol this subject followed. They started at 5 miles per hour, and they stayed there for 2 minutes, then went up to 6 miles per hour, 7, 8, and then stayed at 8 miles per hour to 2% grade. So that was the protocol that they followed. Here is some data that you will need about the subject to do some of the graphs and answer some of the questions. So that's all this subject did, okay? And we'll work with some of that data, like I said, in the data and graph section and answering questions, but that's for another day. I want to spend a little bit more time on the submaximal exercise test because this is something that we haven't done yet, right? You've all seen the max test because we've done that in lab. But the submaximal test, because heart rate is directly related to VO2 and exercise intensity and energy demands, we know, oops, let me make this a little smaller here. Okay, we know that if we have small increases in exercise intensity, that'll elicit a small increase in heart rate, in VO2, and energy demand. And if we have a big increase, so if we have a big increase in exercise intensity, that would elicit a big increase in heart rate, VO2, and energy demand. So because of this known relationship, we can predict a person's maximal capacity using a submaximal test. So for this submaximal test, there is something called a YMCA protocol, but I didn't use that one. We just used a simple treadmill test. Okay, and so what this treadmill test is every subject starts at 3 miles per hour. So we have a subject on the treadmill at 3 miles per hour, and after they're there for 2 or 3 minutes, we measure their heart rate. And then that heart rate, while they're at 3 miles per hour, determines the subsequent workloads. So if their heart rate is less than 90 beats per minute, here's the protocol they would follow. If it's between 90 and 100 beats per minute, here's the protocol that they would follow. And if their heart rate is greater than 100 beats per minute, here's the protocol that they would follow. And for this test, we do this first workload and get a heart rate. That kind of helps us determine fitness level of the subject. Because if a subject is really fit, we don't want them to follow this workload here. We want them to follow a workload that's going to get their heart rate up to around 150 beats per minute, but we don't have to go through 6 or 7 workloads to do that. So we take this heart rate in this first stage at 3 miles per hour to help us better determine which protocol and how quickly to increase that intensity of their workload on them. So that's why we do that. So for our subject, and it was the same, I'm using the same subject data, I believe, from the VO2 max test. Here's their data. And here is what this subject did. So their first workload was at 3 miles per hour, and there was their heart rate. Then based on that heart rate, here was their second workload, and here was their third workload. Again, we only went to a third workload. We didn't do a fourth workload up there, right? Because there is a fourth. We didn't do that fourth workload because once you have some heart rates between 110 and 150 beats per minute, we can stop the test. Now, we actually only have one in between there, but that's okay. We have 3 heart rates here, so we didn't have to go over 150 beats per minute because this is a submaximal exercise test. So that's the protocol that we used for this subject. Again, they started at that 3 miles per hour. We measured a heart rate, and then based on that heart rate, we used this protocol here. Right? Based on that heart rate, this is the protocol that we used, and this is the data that we used. So this is the data that you're going to need to graph for the lab. So I'm just going to look at real quick the data and the graphs. You can see there are going to be 2 graphs that we're going to do. Acute exercise, we're going to use ventilation and VO2. We're going to talk about that ventilatory threshold. So definitely before tackling this lab. And you should already be well versed in that after watching some of the Chapter 8 videos and answering some of those questions, and hopefully going to the virtual classroom as well. And I'll also go over how to do this VO2 max prediction graph, which is also addressed in, I think it's the Chapter 8 heart rate video. So that should look familiar to you as well, and it's addressed in your book. You can see, then of course there are questions that go along with this graph, with this lab. So here are the questions. And again, I'll have a separate video to go over each of these questions as well. All right. Thanks for listening.